Claire stood in the hospital corridor while Daniel signed the papers beside his new wife. The fluorescent lights flattened everything into pale gold and gray, and the sharp scent of antiseptic clung to the air like a warning. Daniel's pen scratched across the clipboard with the kind of confidence men only used when they thought the room belonged to them. His new wife, Vanessa, wore a cream coat and a smile so polished it seemed practiced in mirrors. Claire didn't move. She had come for a reason no one in that corridor knew yet. Before this night was over, Daniel would learn she had not walked back into his life for him at all. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in a steady, impatient rhythm, and a nurse pushed a cart that rattled softly over the tile. Claire tightened her fingers around the folder in her hand and watched Daniel glance up, ready to dismiss her the way he always had. "You're still here?" he asked, as if her presence were an inconvenience. Vanessa's eyes moved over Claire's plain coat, her sensible shoes, the thin line of strain she had carried into the hospital without a single word. Then Vanessa smiled and let her voice drip just enough to wound. "I thought you'd understand a new arrangement by now," she said, resting one manicured hand lightly on Daniel's arm. "Some people are meant to move on." A nearby family went quiet. Even the vending machine hum seemed to thin. Claire looked at Vanessa's hand, then at Daniel's face. His wedding ring had replaced the one he used to wear to their anniversary dinners, but the habit of avoiding her eyes had not changed at all. He turned the clipboard over in his hands. Already done with her, already certain. Claire set the folder on the counter and opened it with calm, precise fingers. Inside was a hospital admission form, a lab request, and a printed note with one name highlighted in yellow. Daniel's. Not as a visitor, not as a husband, as the only person who matched the bloodline needed for a patient upstairs. He frowned, just slightly, the first crack in the easy look he wore. "What is this?" he asked. Claire didn't answer him right away. She looked past him toward the swinging doors leading deeper into the ward, where a light above one room blinked amber and then steady white. The nurse at the station stopped typing. Vanessa's smile faded by a degree. Claire finally spoke, her voice low enough that Daniel had to lean in to hear it. "Why do you think the doctor asked for you tonight?" Daniel opened his mouth, but the words didn't come cleanly this time. The corridor felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls had shifted to listen. Footsteps approached from behind, measured and unhurried, and a man in a dark coat stepped into the light at the end of the hall. Ethan Cole. His badge caught the glow from the overhead lamp. His expression did not change as his eyes moved from Claire to Daniel to the folder on the counter. He took in the scene in one glance, then stopped beside Claire like he had already decided which side of the room mattered. Daniel's hand hovered over the papers, suddenly uncertain. Ethan looked at the highlighted name, then at Daniel, and said in a voice that cut cleanly through the silence, "Mr. Hayes, I believe you should sit down." Claire didn't move when Ethan said it. She only looked past Daniel, toward the folder on the counter, where a single page had slid halfway out beneath the harsh white lamp. The paper looked too thin for the weight it carried. Daniel finally took the chair by the wall, but he did it with the stiff, reluctant motion of a man being escorted to his own undoing. The corridor smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat, and somewhere behind the nurse's station, a printer kept spitting out pages in a restless, mechanical rhythm. Ethan set a hand on the folder and turned it toward himself. His cuff brushed the laminate with a dry whisper. "This file was flagged for a reason," he said, not raising his voice. Claire reached for the edge of the papers before Daniel could, and her fingertips paused on the top sheet. There, in the blue-black stamp of the hospital's intake office, was her name. Not Daniel's. Not the new wife's. Hers. Daniel stared at it like it had insulted him in public. "That's impossible," he muttered, but Ethan didn't look at him. He looked at Claire, then at the bracelet resting against her wrist, the one she had worn into the hospital without thinking, a plain silver band catching the light every time she moved. "Mrs. Hayes," he said carefully, "the notation on this visit was entered by your late husband's care team 3 years ago. It was never meant to reach the wrong family." The words landed hard and clean in the narrow hall. Daniel pushed himself up from the chair. "Late husband?" he repeated, and the color drained from his face in a slow, visible wave. Claire closed the folder with one steady motion, the kind that made no sound at all. A nurse passed behind them, wheels squeaking softly against the floor, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a tired, faint buzz. Ethan opened the first page and turned it so both of them could see the signature at the bottom. It was neat, slanted, unmistakable. Not a hospital form, a directive. This appointment was originally tied to an inheritance update, he said, and your ex-wife is the only person named to receive it. Daniel's hand hit the back of the chair, so hard the metal legs scraped the tile. He looked from Ethan to Claire, then to the sealed envelope sitting inside the folder like a verdict waiting to be opened. No, he said, but the word had lost its weight before it reached the end of the hall. Claire slid the envelope out, turned it once between her fingers, and felt the raised seal under her thumb. The wax was cool, almost brittle. Ethan took one step back and nodded toward the elevators. There's a conference room upstairs, he said. If you want the rest read in private, we can do that now. Daniel took one step forward instead. Claire, wait. She didn't answer. She only lifted the envelope, looked at the name written across it, and walked toward the elevators with Ethan beside her, while Daniel stood in the fluorescent spill of the corridor, staring at the chair he had just been told to sit in. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, spilling a narrow band of polished brass light across Claire's shoes as she stepped into the conference room upstairs. The air smelled faintly of coffee gone cold and paper warmed by fluorescent bulbs. Ethan set the folder on the long table, its leather surface catching the light like wet stone, then drew out the envelope with the sealed crest still intact. Claire's fingers hovered over it once before she broke the wax, the crack sharp in the quiet room. Inside was a single page and a hospital bill folded twice over, both crisp enough to suggest they had been handled only a few times. Ethan glanced at the top line, then at Claire. You need to read this before Daniel does, he said, sliding the page closer. Claire did not sit. She stood with one hand braced on the back of a chair, her reflection pale in the dark glass behind Ethan, while the city below blinked in the early evening haze. On the page, a date sat beside a private hospital name in downtown Chicago, and beneath it, a name she recognized immediately. Not Daniel's, not hers. The door behind them clicked open again, and Daniel entered without his jacket, tie loosened, one hand still red from gripping the corridor railing too hard. His eyes went straight to the paper. What is that? Claire turned the page toward him just enough for him to see the hospital header, then kept her hand there, steady. A visit, she said. Daniel took one step closer. The overhead lights turned the pale color of the room almost silver, and in that brightness his wedding ring flashed against the wood as he reached out, then stopped. Ethan moved first, placing one hand flat on the table. Not here, he said. Daniel ignored him. His gaze snagged on the second sheet as Claire unfolded it, a discharge summary with a line highlighted in yellow. The words were clinical, but the effect was immediate. Daniel read once, then again, and the color drained from his face in a way no apology ever had. He pulled a chair out behind him, not to sit, but because his hand needed something to grip. Claire watched him work through the page, watched his jaw tighten at the signatures, the dates, the familiar medication schedule, the note from the attending physician. None of them said what he was already understanding. She set the papers down and reached into her bag, drawing out a small plastic pharmacy receipt from the same hospital. It crinkled softly between her fingers. I went alone, she said. The room seemed to narrow around that one sentence. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. He looked toward Ethan, as if the answer might be hiding there, but Ethan only stepped back and let the silence do its work. Claire folded the receipt once and placed it on top of the discharge summary, aligning the edges with precise, deliberate care. You remarried, she said, her voice even, and I still had to handle it alone. Daniel's hand closed around the back of the chair until the wood gave a low creak. Outside the glass wall, a train slid past on the tracks below, its lights streaking white through the dusk. He stared at the papers, then at her. Claire. She lifted her chin, not letting him finish. No, she said. Now you're going to listen. She reached into the envelope one last time and drew out a second document, smaller than the others, stamped with the hospital's red seal. Ethan saw it first. His brows tightened. Claire held it up between them, and Daniel took an instinctive step forward as the page turned in her hand. Whatever was written there had not been meant for a hallway, or a courtroom, or a man who believed divorce had ended every obligation. Claire placed it on top of the stack, looked at Daniel once, and slid the whole file across the table toward him. "Read that," she said, "and then tell me why you were there." By the time Claire reached the parking garage, the evening air had turned sharp enough to sting through her coat. The concrete still held the day's heat, but the wind coming off the river cut between the parked cars, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and wet asphalt. She stood under a row of buzzing fluorescent lights, the hospital file tucked under her arm, and watched Daniel stop beside his black sedan. He didn't open the door. He didn't reach for his phone. He just stood there with the papers in his hand, the page with the red seal catching and releasing the light as his fingers tightened around it. Ethan had already seen enough to go still. Daniel had seen enough to stop pretending. Claire folded her arms and waited. A delivery truck groaned somewhere below, and the sound rolled through the garage like distant thunder. Daniel looked up at her at last, his jaw set hard, one hand flattened over the document as if pressure alone could keep the words from moving. "This is a mistake," he said. Claire didn't answer. She just held out her palm. Daniel's gaze dropped to it, then back to her face. He turned the page over, read the hospital letter again, and the color in his face changed by degrees, not all at once. First the eyes, then the mouth, then the hand that lowered a fraction, losing its grip on the file. Ethan took one step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. "What does it say?" he asked. Claire looked at him, then at Daniel. "It says," she replied, "that while you were busy signing divorce papers, someone else was in that hospital room." A silence settled between them, broken only by the hum of the lights overhead. Daniel's thumb moved over the red stamp, rubbing at it, as if the ink might smear under enough friction. "Who?" he asked. Claire reached into the envelope and removed the folded admission form. The paper was thin, slightly yellowed at the edges, and she held it up just long enough for him to see the name printed at the top. Daniel stared at it. Ethan leaned in. Claire let the form drop back into her hand. "You told me to move on," she said. "I did, but you don't get to rewrite what happened while I was carrying your silence." The words landed cleanly. No raised voice. No trembling. Just the quiet scrape of truth against a polished floor. Daniel's other hand moved to the car roof and stayed there, fingers spread wide, bracing himself against the metal. His wedding ring flashed once under the fluorescent lights. Claire noticed it, but only for a second. Then she opened the file wider, flipped to the next page, and took one step back. Inside the document was the hospital's transfer notice, the kind printed in duplicate, stamped in red, signed in blue. Daniel reached for it. Claire pulled it back before his fingers touched the paper. "Read the name," she said. He did, and whatever he saw there made him finally look past the divorce, past the anger, past the story he had told himself to survive it. Ethan's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Claire!" She closed the file with one hand, held his stare for one beat, and slid the papers into her bag. Then she turned toward the elevator doors at the far end of the garage, where the metal panel gleamed under the lights like a promise. Behind her, Daniel took a single step forward. "Wait," he said. Claire didn't stop walking. She only lifted her hand once, not in farewell, but in warning, as the elevator chimed open and the doors began to part. The elevator doors slid open with a soft metallic sigh, spilling a wash of white light across the garage floor. Claire stepped forward first, her heels clicking once against the polished concrete, then falling quiet as she crossed into the waiting hall beyond. The air changed immediately, less exhaust, more antiseptic, a cold, clean scent that clung to the back of the throat. Daniel followed, still holding the transfer notice she had let him read only long enough to understand it was real. He looked from the paper to Claire, then toward the hospital entrance glowing at the end of the corridor like a stage set under fluorescent lights. "You brought me here for this?" he asked. but his voice had lost the sharp edge it carried in the garage. Claire didn't answer. She simply opened the glass door and let the cooler air from inside brush across her face. Somewhere deeper in the building, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm, thin and distant, like a metronome counting down to something neither of them could stop. Daniel caught up beside her, his reflection sliding across the glass beside hers. "If there's something I need to know, tell me now." Claire stopped at the reception desk, where a nurse in pale blue scrubs was sorting charts beneath a lamp that cast a warm yellow circle over the counter. She placed her bag down carefully, then drew out a second folder, thicker than the first, the corners worn soft from handling. "There's something you should see before anyone else does," she said, and laid it on the counter without looking away from him. The nurse glanced up, then discreetly stepped aside. Daniel's fingers hovered over the folder, but Claire flipped it open herself and slid a single page across the glossy surface. He read the line at the top, then the name beneath it. His jaw tightened. A cart rolled past behind him, wheels whispering over the tile. At the end of the hall, a doctor in green scrubs paused near the ICU sign and checked his watch. Claire closed the folder again with a quiet snap. "This visit wasn't about your wife," she said, each word level and measured. "It was about what happens when the divorce papers stop being the last word." Daniel looked at her, as if he were trying to find the version of her he thought he knew. Instead, he found the woman standing straight under the hospital lights, one hand resting on the folder, the other already reaching for the visitor badge clipped to her coat. The receptionist's printer hummed. Somewhere behind the frosted windows, a gurney squeaked down another corridor. Daniel exhaled once, slow and uneven, then took the visitor badge from Claire's hand when she offered it. Not like a man being granted entry, but like someone accepting terms he no longer controlled. She turned toward the elevator bank near the nurse's station and pressed the call button. The panel lit up amber, reflecting in the polished floor between them. Daniel stood still as the doors waited to open, and when they did, Claire stepped in first. Before the doors could close, she looked back at him and said, "If you want answers, you're coming in with me. If you want the truth, you'll have to hear it from the person inside that room." The elevator door slid shut on the hospital corridor with a soft metallic hush, and Claire stood under the pale fluorescent wash without moving. One hand braced around a manila folder, the other steady on the rail, as the car rose. Daniel stayed a half step behind her, his reflection fractured in the brushed steel wall, his tie loosened from the drive over, and his coat carrying the cold smell of rain from the parking lot. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the lift and the faint click of Claire's heel against the floor when the car stopped. On the third floor, she led him out into a narrower hallway where the lights were dimmer, warmer, almost yellow against the beige paint. At the end of the corridor, room 314 sat with its door cracked open, a bar of white light slipping across the tile. Claire paused there just long enough to straighten the visitor badge on her coat, then pushed the door wider and stepped aside. "He's awake," she said, and her voice was calm in the way a blade is calm. Daniel looked past her shoulder first, not at the bed, but at the figure in the chair beside it. A man in a dark sweater rose slowly, one palm still resting on the mattress as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He was older than Daniel, silver at the temples, composed in a way that made the room feel smaller. Claire didn't introduce him. She didn't need to. She moved to the side table, set the folder down, and drew out a stack of papers clipped together with a black binder clip. The paper edges flashed under the bedside lamp, crisp and official. "Before you say anything," she told Daniel, "read the chart." Daniel took the top sheet with 2 fingers. His eyes moved once, then again, slower this time, as if the words had changed shape in his hands. The man in the chair said nothing. He only reached for the water glass, took a small sip, and set it down with a soft tap against the metal tray. Claire watched Daniel's face as the color drained from it, not all at once, but in stages, like a curtain falling room by room. He turned the page, then another. The rustle of paper sounded too loud in the tight little room. "No," he said finally, but it came out thin, almost polite, as if he were asking the hospital to correct a mistake in scheduling. Claire took the papers back from him and slid them across the blanket toward the patient. "Your signature is on the consent form," she said, "and hers is on the line for emergency contact." She nodded toward the man in the chair. "You asked for the truth. Here it is." Daniel stared at the bed, at the pulse monitor blinking green and steady beside it, at the cast on the patient's wrist, at the wedding band missing from Claire's hand, and the quiet authority in the way she now stood between them. The man in the chair finally looked up. "I'm the one you left behind," he said, his tone even, almost courteous. Daniel's mouth opened, then shut again. Claire reached into the folder one last time and held out a sealed envelope with his name on it, written in neat black ink. "You can open it now," she said, "or you can wait until morning. But either way, you're staying until you understand why I brought you here." The room held its breath in layers. The soft beep of the monitor, the dry rustle of Claire's coat as she crossed to the window, the stale warmth of antiseptic and old coffee settling in the corners. Daniel stood near the door under the pale wash of a wall sconce, still wearing the kind of polished composure that only survived in places where no one had yet challenged him. Then Claire moved, and the whole balance of the room shifted with her. She set the sealed envelope on the overbed table, slid it to the center, and let her fingertips rest on the paper for one quiet second. "Before you open that," she said, her voice level over the hum of the fluorescent lights, "there's something else you should know." Daniel glanced at the envelope, then at her left hand, bare now except for a thin ridge of skin where a ring had once lived. He did not reach for it. He looked past her shoulder instead to the man in the chair. The man said nothing. He only folded his hands over a cane with a silver handle and waited, the way men with real patience usually did. Claire walked to the chart rack at the foot of the bed and pulled free a second folder. Its corners were bent soft from use. She opened it just enough for Daniel to see the top page, the bold header, the signature lines. "Hospital authorization. Temporary medical proxy. Emergency contact update." Daniel frowned and took one step forward. Claire closed the folder again before he could read more. "You were never supposed to find out like this," she said. A bitter little laugh escaped him, quick and sharp. "Find out what?" "That you dragged me here to play games." The man in the chair lifted his chin toward the folder. "No games," he said. "Just paperwork. The kind you never bothered to read." Claire crossed her arms, the fabric of her sleeve whispering against itself. Outside, rain tapped against the glass in a slow, steady rhythm, turning the parking lot lights into blurred gold streaks. Inside, Daniel's phone vibrated once in his pocket, then fell silent. He ignored it. "You think this makes you powerful?" he asked. Claire did not answer right away. She turned toward the bedside table, picked up a plain white medication cup, and set it down again without taking anything. "No," she said at last. "What makes me powerful is that I stopped asking you for permission." Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at the envelope again, then at the folder, then at the man in the chair, as if one of them might start explaining themselves out of mercy. None did. Claire reached for the envelope and pressed it into his chest with just enough force to make him catch it. "Open it here," she said, "in front of both of us." He did not move. She waited. The monitor kept its patient green pulse. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled over polished tile with a low metallic hum. Daniel finally tore the seal with his thumb. Inside was a single sheet and a set of appointment papers. His eyes moved once, twice, then stopped. Claire watched the color leave his face as he read the line printed beneath the hospital letterhead. "Effective immediately, all major decisions for the patient's care will be made by Claire Morgan." He looked up slowly, and for the first time since he walked in, he had nothing ready to say. Claire held his gaze, then took the papers from his hand and laid them back on the blanket like a verdict. "Tomorrow morning," she said, reaching for the light switch, "you'll come with me to the family conference room. And this time, you'll hear everything." The next morning, the family conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and antiseptic, a stubborn mix that clung to the curtains and the carpet. Claire stood at the head of the long oak table, one hand resting on a stack of hospital forms, the other holding a folder stamped with the seal of St. Anne's. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early, tie straight, jaw tight, and in the seat beside him was his wife, Melissa, wearing cream silk and a look meant to sharpen every room she entered. She did not bother to sit until Claire did. The fluorescent lights above them cast everything in a clean, unforgiving white. "We're here for one reason," Claire said, sliding the folder forward. "Your wife asked for an update. I said we discuss the care plan together." Melissa's fingers tightened around her purse. "That's not what Daniel said this was." Claire opened the folder and placed 3 papers on the table, each one aligned with painful precision. An attending physician's recommendation, a financial authorization form, and a legal notice from the hospital board. Daniel glanced down, then away. He had clearly not expected the board letter to be there, nor the signature already waiting at the bottom. Claire's pen rested beside it like a small, dark promise. "The board has reviewed the last 6 months of billing irregularities," she said. "They wanted a clarification on who approved the transfer of funds from a joint account." The room went still except for the low buzz of the air vent overhead. Melissa turned slowly toward Daniel. "Joint account." Daniel lifted a hand, then let it fall, his cuff brushing the polished table. "It was temporary," he muttered, reaching for the paper. Claire stopped him with 2 fingers on the page. "Not hard, just enough. Temporary doesn't explain the signature," she said. "It also doesn't explain why the hospital received a partial payment from a business line under your name the same week my treatment was delayed." Melissa's chair scraped back an inch. Daniel looked up then, and in the hard reflection of the conference room glass, Claire could see the exact moment he understood this was no private argument. This was a room with witnesses. Claire tapped the legal notice once. "From this point forward, every major decision comes through me. That includes access, scheduling, and discharge approval." Melissa let out a small laugh, brittle as cracked ice. "You can't cut a spouse out of a hospital file." Claire's answer was already waiting. She reached into the folder, removed one final sheet, and turned it toward them. The printed line at the bottom was clean and absolute. "Emergency proxy revoked." Daniel's throat moved. Melissa stared at the page, as if it had changed shape in front of her. Claire gathered the papers, stacked them, and slid them into her own bag. Then she stood, smoothed the sleeve of her coat, and looked at Daniel without raising her voice. "You wanted everything handled quietly," she said. "Now it is." She picked up the pen, signed the final form, and handed the original to the nurse waiting by the door. The nurse left without a word, her shoes soft against the tile. Daniel rose halfway from his chair. "Claire, we can talk about this." She reached for the door handle, paused just long enough for both of them to feel the silence, then turned back. "No," she said. "Today you'll listen." Claire didn't rush when she opened the door. The hospital corridor outside was washed in pale morning light, the kind that made every chrome rail look cold and every sound sharpen into something brittle. Daniel followed her into the hall, his shoes whispering over the polished floor, while Melissa stayed near the doorway, one hand locked around the edge of the frame, as if the room might tilt without her. Claire stopped beside a row of vending machines, humming softly under the fluorescent glow. In her hand, the folder felt thin now, almost harmless, but the weight of what it meant had already settled into the space between them. Daniel took one step closer. "If this is about money, we can fix it." Claire turned the revoked proxy form over once, then tucked it into the folder without looking at him. "No," she said. "This is about distance." A nurse rolled a cart past them, the metal wheels rattling faintly against the tile, and Claire waited until the sound faded. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out another document, a clean legal page with her signature already in place. Daniel glanced at it, then at her. His face changed first in the small way men's faces do when a door closes and they only hear the click after it's done. "You filed to remove my name from the medical decision list," he said. Claire slipped the paper back into the folder. "I filed everything," she replied. "Your lawyer will get the rest by noon." Melissa let out a short, breathless laugh that sounded wrong in the quiet hall. "You can't just erase a marriage." Claire's fingers tightened once around the strap of her bag. The leather creaked. "No," she said, calm and level, "but I can erase access." The elevator chimed at the end of the corridor, and when the doors opened, a man in a charcoal coat stepped out carrying a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in brown paper. He wasn't rushing. He didn't have to. The flowers gave off a clean, green scent that cut through the sterile hospital air. And when he saw Claire, he crossed the hall with an easy steadiness that made Daniel straighten without meaning to. Claire took the bouquet from him, their fingers brushing for only a second. "You made it," she said. "Always," Evan replied. He looked at Daniel once, not with challenge, but with the flat courtesy of a man who had already been briefed on everything that mattered. He handed Claire a slim envelope from the hospital administration, then stepped back beside her without claiming space she hadn't offered. Claire opened the envelope, scanned the first line, and closed it again. "They've updated the consent records," she said. "Effective immediately." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You really did all this before talking to me?" Claire lifted her eyes to his. "You had years to talk," she said. "You used them differently." For a moment, nothing moved except the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the slow rise and fall of a coffee cup on the receptionist's desk as someone set it down too hard. Then Daniel looked past her, to the envelope, to the man beside her, to the lilies in her arms, and something in him finally gave way. Not loudly, not in a way anyone could point to later, just enough to change the shape of the day. "What happens now?" he asked. Claire adjusted the flowers against her coat. The paper rustled softly. "Now," she said, "you sign what needs signing, you stay where you're allowed to stay, and you stop asking me to carry the life you walked away from." She turned toward the elevator, and Evan stepped with her, not ahead, just beside. Daniel remained in the hallway, framed by the sterile light and the closed room behind him, while Claire pressed the call button and watched the numbers above the doors blink toward her. When the elevator arrived, she stepped inside without hesitation, the lilies bright against the dark wool of her coat. The doors began to slide shut, and Daniel moved as if to speak, then stopped. Claire didn't look back. She only lifted one hand, not in farewell, but in finality, and let the doors close on the life that had once asked her to shrink.